Tonight we're going to put a brisket on the offset smoker and get it started. Doesn't that look good? Stick around and find out how I did this. What we have here is a whole brisket flat. Not a whole brisket, but a whole brisket flat. They already removed the point off of this, the top part. I believe that's called a decal muscle. I didn't want to get a flat, but this is all they had available, so I got one of these. I got this at Sam's Club. This is almost 9 pounds. I paid $5.54 a pound, which was about $49. Now, if you were to get this at your local meat market, you would probably pay about twice that amount for the same choice cut of meat. Here are the ingredients I'll be using. First, I got some coarse salt, and of course we'll use some black pepper. I'll probably grind that medium. And I got some Better Than Bouillon beef flavoring and some Johnny's au jus concentrate, which I really like that stuff. I'll be using this to make some au jus. I like having brisket in sandwiches and having some dipping sauce. And then I got some regular beef bouillon here that I'll be adding with the water that's in the pan in the smoker. I also got some Tony Chachere's Creole seasoning there. I'll be using plenty of that as well. This is the point here where I would normally trim a whole bunch of fat off. Now, being that this is just a brisket flat and not a whole brisket, there isn't a lot of fat here. There's a little spots around the edges I'll probably clean up, but other than that, it's ready to season and go in the smoker. If you look at the screen there on the right side where there's meat exposed there, normally there would be a big chunk of meat on there, and that end of the brisket would be at least 2 or 3 times thicker than the other end, which is the flat end. The point end has always got a big chunk of meat there on a whole brisket. This does not have that. Oh well, that's all they had. I wish I could have had that for the purpose of this video, but that didn't work out, so we're just going to deal with it. When you slice a brisket, you always want to slice against the grain, and after it's cooked, it can be difficult to tell which way the grain is going. So you can flip the brisket over, find the grain where it's easy to see, and make a few slits in it so that you can, after it's done cooking, you can flip it over and look, and you can tell which way the grain is going. If this were a whole brisket, that top muscle that has been taken off here has grain that runs the other way, so it becomes a little bit tricky to slice them. I can't demonstrate that here because I don't have a whole brisket. It's time to slap some seasoning on this and get my fire going, and once it's ready, throw it on the smoker. So I rinsed the brisket good and then patted it dry with paper towel, and now it's ready to be seasoned. You can be pretty generous with the seasoning. Get a good coat of it on there. It would be actually difficult, I think, to get too much seasoning on there. Keep in mind that you really should try to get it all the way around the brisket, all surfaces, and you really don't need to rub, though this stuff is often called rub. There's really no need to rub it in. Just sprinkling it on and patting it is plenty good. It will draw moisture from the meat and cling to the meat pretty good. You don't really need to rub it. A lot of people will inject it. I don't see any need for that. I don't understand it myself. This stuff is so flavorful that why you would need to inject more flavoring is beyond me. But some people do, and you might want to experiment with that. Whenever you're seasoning meats, you always want to be careful about contaminating things. I usually try to keep one hand that handles the meat and touches the meat, and the other hand clean, and that handles the spices and whatnot. Be aware of that and keep that in mind so you're not getting beef blood or germs or whatnot all over your seasonings and your cocktail glass and all that. I should mention too that when I had this slab of meat sitting here on my patio table with no seasoning on it, there were flies, 4 or 5 at least flies landing all over it, and I continued to have to shoo them away. And I sprinkled on some of that Tony Chachere's spicy kind of seasoning, Creole seasoning, and the flies disappeared. And I had never really noticed that before, but I'll be checking that out again to see if that's a way to keep flies off meat if you got it sitting out, is to sprinkle some of that around. I've got two drip pans set up. Both of them have hot water in it, and I added some bouillon to each. You can use whatever brand of bouillon or whatever type you want to use. The drip pans here serve a couple of purposes. One is it'll catch drippings from the brisket, and I will use that as my dipping au jus, and it also will catch at least a lot of the fat drippings that I don't need all over the inside of my grill. But the other purpose is to have water in there. Having water in there will help your meat not to dry out. Whenever I'm cooking a larger piece of meat, well, pretty much anything except for jerky, I add water. Keep in mind that this will evaporate, and in a long cook like this, you'll have to refill those 2 or 3 times at least. For this cook, I'll be using charcoal for the heat source, and I've also got some apple wood that I inherited from my dad, who passed away about a year and a half ago. I'll be using that up to add some flavor, and I've never used apple wood in a smoke before. You can use whatever kind of wood you have or whatever you want, or you can just use charcoal. And I probably won't use but maybe half of this bundle of apple wood. We got the fire ready, and the brisket is all seasoned up and ready to put on there. It's time to close this up and get it going. Now normally when you're doing a whole brisket, you want to put the thick end of the brisket towards the hotter part of your smoker. Being that this is not a whole brisket but a flat, about halfway through I'm going to go ahead and rotate this and put the other end towards the hot part of the smoker. But you normally wouldn't need to do that with a whole brisket. In the past I've learned a lesson, and that is that I try not to make a brisket on the same day I'm going to have guests waiting to be served, because it can be very difficult to predict when it's going to be done, and it can take a long time. If you got dinner guests coming over at 5 or 6, you had better be thinking about, and you want to do it that day, you're going to have to get out of bed about 3 in the morning and get things going if you're going to have any chance of having it ready by dinner time. So what I'm doing here, I start it the evening before. It's about 8 o'clock here. I'm going to nurse the fire and keep some smoke going on it until about midnight. I'm going to go to bed at that point. I'll put some coals and some smoking wood in the firebox, and I'll close the dampers down so it doesn't get overly hot. And after I do that, I might watch it for another half hour just to make sure that things aren't going to get overly hot. And then I'll just let it go overnight. I'll sleep for 5.5 hours, and get up in the morning and get it going again. Now, doing it this way, sometime tomorrow afternoon, this will be done cooking. It might be 1, it might be 3, something like that. Either way, I'll be able to stop adding coals to the fire. I'll be able to wrap my brisket and just let it rest and keep warm until dinner time. I found that's the most convenient way to do it. Another way to do it is also, you can, if you got a free day on a Saturday, and you can make your brisket whenever you want, get it all done, and you can then just put it in the fridge or wrapped in foil on the day that you have guests coming over. Slice it up and put it in the crock pot with some au jus, let it simmer in there for 3 or 4 hours, and then you can serve right out of there. So you can actually, cook your brisket days in advance. Actually, brisket done that way is really, really good. It isn't going to lessen the quality. I do somewhat prefer having it hot off the smoker after it rests for an hour or so, but reheating it in a crock pot is just as good, almost. But the point is, if you have guests coming at a particular time and they're going to be hungry, it's almost impossible to ensure that your brisket is going to be hot and ready just by cooking it that day and crossing your fingers and hoping. It might work out, and it might not. Your guests might have to sit until 8 or 9 before they can eat. Let's talk a little bit about temperatures. I'm going to be trying to maintain a temperature in the smoking chamber of about 225 degrees. I've found that this particular grill, this offset smoker, does pretty well at maintaining 225 degrees. If I want to try to do something at 250, it takes a lot of effort and a lot of fuel to get it to maintain that hot of a temperature. Your grill or smoker might be different. Okay, so it's about midnight or so. Brisket has been on the smoker for about 4 hours or so. I'm checking it for the last time right now, and I just stoked up the fire and got that going pretty good. And it has been running a little hotter than 225, which is fine. I got things going now. I got the lid open now, so we got some flames here. I'll be shutting things down, closing dampers down, and just letting it go while I go get some sleep, and we'll pick it up in the morning. And so far, it's looking really good. You might notice that I've got a can of baked beans sitting here, getting warmed up. And down the lower part, I got a couple of hot dogs cooking. That's going to be my dinner for tonight. So it is about 5:45 the next morning. I see there's still about 150 degrees in the smoking chamber. So things went well overnight. We'll take a look in the firebox and see what kind of coals we got to work with. Get things stoked up. Open the dampers. Get the fire going again. And we'll continue this cook. The brisket is looking fantastic. I see that I will have to replenish water in my water pans, especially the one that's nearest to the heat. That's almost dried up, so I'll get that going. Get some water in there. And speaking of water, my mouth is watering just looking at this. But let's give it a few more hours of cook time and see where we're at. It's now about 11 a.m. and our brisket has had several more hours of maintaining about 225 in the smoking chamber. I'm going to pull it off and I'm going to give it a jiggle test and a probe test and wrap it up and throw some au jus in with it and put it back in the smoker. When you give your brisket a little slap, it should kind of jiggle and wiggle like a bowl of jello almost. And you can also probe it with your meat thermometer and it should feel fairly tender. Now this one isn't quite done. I mean, technically it's done, but it's really not perfection done. And what I'm going to do is wrap it up and add some au jus and then put it back in the smoker and then let the fire die down very slowly over a long period of time and just let this slow cook. Basically, you're slow cooking it at this point. It's almost the same as putting it in a crock pot. You got the meat wrapped in an environment with moisture, and you're just low cooking at a low temperature. You're not trying to reach any magical 200 degrees or anything like that. And I know that there's probably a lot of people that raise their eyebrows when I say that. The magical temperature that most people will tell you is 200 degrees. Your meat a brisket has to get to 200 degrees. And I don't think that's true. In the last at least 2 briskets I've done have shown that to me. This brisket never got any hotter than about 180 degrees, but the difference is it had several hours, many hours of low temperature cooking, which is kind of the secret to slow cooking or a slow cooker. It heats things over a long period of time, but at a lower temperature. I think that if you heat a brisket, especially a brisket flat that didn't have much fat in it, and you get that to 200 degrees, I think you're going to have some dry meat and maybe a little tough. I encourage you to try cooking this way. Don't let your meat get hotter than about 180 degrees, but give it plenty of time. And when you slap your brisket, it should wiggle like a bowl of jello. If it doesn't, it's not quite done yet. Wrap it up, make sure there's moisture in there, and just let it slow cook. Remember, we're not in a hurry. We're not meeting any deadline. This is before noon. I could really literally be serving people by 2 o'clock this afternoon. Although I'm just going to let this sit until dinner time tonight. So now I'm done babysitting this fire. I'm going to close everything down, close the lid, close the dampers down. I'm going to replenish some water here in my pans, and then I can go do other things, and I don't have to worry about this. I can come back out here whenever I feel like eating, and I'm ready to slice and eat. Okay, so it's now almost 8 o'clock at night, and I'm finally getting around to this. Other things came up, and I wasn't able to get at this sooner. If you remember, before we put this on the smoker, we cut some slits on the underside of it, indicating which way the grain was going. This is now the point where it's going to be kind of hard to tell, but you can flip it over and find those slits, and it'll tell you which way the grain is going, and of course you want to cut against or across the grain. And yes, this brisket has been sitting wrapped with juice inside the wrappings since noon, and just letting the firebox slowly die away. I think the smoke chamber had cooled down to about 120 degrees. The brisket had cooled down very slowly. It's now at a temperature that is perfect for eating. I can slice it without burning my hands. It all worked out perfectly, but certainly I could have pulled this off sooner. But that's the beauty of doing a brisket the day before. So there's no deadlines, there's no pressure. This brisket was basically in the smoker for close to 24 hours. The temperatures were not always at 225 or even in that neighborhood. There were many hours of that cook where the temperature was much lower than that. But that's called slow cooking. And low and slow is the best way to do brisket in my mind. And the lower and the slower, I think better. And I think if you do it low enough and slow enough, you don't need to worry about getting your meat to 200 degrees. I think you run the risk of drying it out. Doesn't that look good? It's got a beautiful smoke ring. Texture is perfect. It's good and juicy. It's about as juicy and tender as a brisket flat can get. And this is some of the best brisket I've ever had. It turned out fantastic. As I mentioned earlier, it's a little blacker than normal, and I think that's because of the applewood. But I guess it's possible that the fire got a little too hot after I went to bed. I don't really think that happened, so I'm going to blame it on the applewood. But I'll show you a few pictures of a brisket that I made last year, and you'll see the color that I am more used to getting. And because this was so black, I was a little concerned. But I got to tell you, it's the best brisket I ever made and the best brisket I ever ate. And the three other people that tried this also agreed that it was the best they ever had. Low and slow is the way to go. When they trimmed this brisket and took off the point, they left part of it here in the center of the brisket, and I'm going to find the fat line there that separates the two muscles and trim that off. The grain is running in a different direction, and I'm going to slice that up separately. As promised, here are some pictures of a brisket I made last fall. You'll notice that this is a whole brisket, and you'll see that one end is like twice as thick as the other end. That has the point still on it. You'll also see that the color isn't quite as black. That brisket was excellent as well, but I gotta say, especially considering that this was a brisket flat only, this was probably better. Let's talk about the au jus for a minute. Normally, I will add some of the other ingredients that I mentioned earlier, along with some of this to make my au jus. As it happens in this cook, the au jus turned out just wonderful the way it is. I didn't use any of the other ingredients. It's not overly fatty. In other words, there's not a huge layer of fat on there. If need be, you can set this in the fridge overnight and then wake up in the morning and all the fat will be hardened on top, and you can just pick that out with a fork or a spoon and get rid of some of that and then go from there on making your au jus. You can save this stuff for soup base or add some to stews to give it some extra flavoring. And this au jus was fantastic. It picked up some of the smoke flavor, some of the flavor from the seasonings, and it was just fantastic. Many people are intimidated by doing a brisket, and I hope that this video helps them understand that it's really very simple and very easy. It's not nearly as hard as most people think. It's actually kind of hard to screw it up. Just take your time. Don't be in a hurry. Don't try to make it the same day you got a guest to serve at 6 o'clock or whatever. Don't give yourself a deadline. Let it happen slow. Click the like button, check out my channel, and leave your comments below, and thanks for watching.